Okay. And this officially kicks off the meeting number 7 of the South Florida Corridors Scoping Group. Hello, everybody. Thank you for making it here today. So today on the agenda, well, first of all, I want to mention that, as usual, the meeting is going to be live streamed through publicinput.com, and that can be accessed from the project website at www.frederickcountymd.gov/8141. And today we have 2 items on the agenda. First, we're going to hear from Caroline Dwyer and Kate Angie from Renaissance Planning. And as I talked about last week, we're going to have a kind of a virtual design charrette, and Renaissance is going to help us with that effort. And we have a history with Renaissance Planning. They were kind of essential in the development of the livable Frederick master plan. They brought a lot of techniques that were really innovative for Frederick County, very kind of intelligent ways of understanding our growth and how to think about how to allocate that growth. So we on planning staff are very excited to be working with Renaissance once again. So Caroline and Kate are going to go over their kind of draft proposal for the charrette and how that'll work. And we'd like to be able to kind of run it by you guys, keeping in mind this is a draft. We want to get your feedback, see what you think, and have some discussion afterwards. Then the second item on the agenda involves something that you've received which contains a list of questions about the South Frederick area. And we'd like to kind of use those questions to guide a discussion about possible approaches and really kind of bring up an aerial, think about those questions relative to the geography on the ground, and begin kind of diagramming out different possible approaches. But before we start any of that, I just wanted to see if anyone has any questions or things they want to share or discuss with the group. So if anyone has anything, just jump on in. And if not, we will hand it off directly to Kate and Carolyn. And thank you guys both for being here today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. We're excited to walk through the proposed strategy and get some feedback. And glad to be back working with Frederick. So quickly, just for what we're going to go through today, we'll do a quick team introduction so you know who we are and what we're planning to do. We'll talk a little bit about the proposed approach, which I understand that you all have received ahead of time, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we're planning to execute this strategy, and also some potential roles for your group and ways that we can all work together to make this a really great series of events. So, oops, hold on. I don't know why I'm on the annotation board here. Okay. So just quickly going to introduce our team. So I'm Caroline Dwyer. I'm a project manager with Renaissance Planning based out of our Durham, North Carolina office. I also have Kate here with me. Kate Angie is the president of Renaissance Planning, and she is based in our Arlington office. And we have some staff who are not on the call with us today, but many have worked in Frederick County in the past on the Livable Frederick project. And then we're also bringing in some new folks who have a variety of different skill sets in facilitating these types of events, and also in graphic design and other types of functions that will be useful for a charrette. Kate, did you want to introduce yourself before we move on?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Kate Angie with Renaissance. As John said, I was fortunate to work on the large Livable Frederick plan, so I'm super happy to be back and working in the county again. So thanks for having us. Go ahead, Caroline.
Great. Okay. So basically, just to kind of bring it back to basics to sort of orient everybody to our approach before getting into the specifics, just thinking broadly about the goals of the South Frederick Corridor Plan, and then our goals for outreach and engagement. So as I'm sure all of you already know, the Frederick County Plan, the Livable Frederick Master Plan really laid out this vibrant approach for the future of the county and ways to start moving towards that future. South Frederick Corridors Plan is part of the implementation element of that broader effort, and really starting to focus in on some specific areas where we can start to imagine a different future. This particular area, of course, is one that's been a major economic center for the county. But as we start to move into the future, thinking about, how this particular area could perhaps evolve differently to better accommodate the types of growth and trends and, things that people want to see in a place like Frederick County. The ultimate sort of goal for this area, as defined in the plan and other documents, is to think about a place that can be more walkable, more functionally diverse, so thinking about a different mix of uses instead of just predominantly commercial uses, sort of more compact and centralized. Part of our job is to help you start to think about ways that you can get there and what that might look like. So we have been brought in to plan and facilitate a workshops type of event. This will look a little different just because of the current conditions that we're in due to public health restrictions and things like this. A year or two ago, this probably would have been more of a hands-on effort. However, we are confident that this can be done just as well virtually. We've worked in other communities doing virtual formats and using sort of a combination of approaches. I think that we'll be able to get lots of great feedback. Our goal is really to get as many people involved as possible, to make it easy and accessible, so as many folks can participate as want to, making sure that when they do show up that, it's an engaging and fun type of event, that they, folks feel listened to and that their input is valued, and making sure that we're able to engage and involve a full cross-section of the community, thinking about that through sort of an equity lens and, who needs to be represented and how we can best make it easy, or how we can make it easier for everybody to participate who should be participating. So I'll stop there for just a second and, maybe listen to you all for a minute and, thinking about the purpose both of the plan, but also the purpose of the engagement and outreach. So two sort of questions we were hoping to get a little bit of preliminary feedback on. One, what do you think needs to be included in a great plan for the South Frederick corridors area? And then also, what does successful outreach and engagement look like for this particular project? So feel free to jump in.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Jamie McKay. A question I have is if we're evaluating metrics or if we'd like to be more qualitative in our approach.
Sure. So do you mean for thinking about what does success look like?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Either I think is a valid type of approach. There is a function for sort of thinking about it in terms of like demographics. We have this many people above the age of 65 and this many people who are, or this percentage of folks who are, representing Latino or Latina populations, and, seeing who we have responding and if those types of things match up. I think also, though, however, there's sort of, as you mentioned, a more qualitative way to kind of assess success and progress. And, we can ask folks who participate, Did you have ideas for that?
Actually, if I could just ask
Sure,
and
go
then
ahead,
follow
Kate.
up too, I think maybe were you asking about the actual plan and how we evaluate success of the plan or the outreach effort? Because I think both have a qualitative and quantitative. So was it to address both or?
My question was primarily targeted at the plan goals, and perhaps
Yeah.
knowing which you'd like to discuss first can help the rest of the scoping group respond more productively to your questions.
Yeah, and if I could take that for a second, I think maybe, John, we may kind of defer back to you a little bit to ask the question about, under the big umbrella of the countywide plan, are there some specific metrics that you've already put out there that you want us to pull into this? So, for instance, like one of the key metrics we know is that this calls for a walkable area. Well, we can measure walkability. So do we want to look at different concepts to say, okay, how walkable is this place in the next 20 years, not just visually, but walk access? Is there a targeted redevelopment scenario where we're trying to say we want to be able to have enough jobs in this area to create an economic impact? So should our designs be quantifying, different concepts that support a certain number of jobs or households, that sort of thing? So have you guys talked about that before, or is that something that you would like us to maybe start coming up with some specific metrics where, as we're looking at different design concepts and redevelopment options and infill options, we can measure those against those sorts of things?
Yeah, that is definitely something we've discussed relative to the development of the Livable Frederick Master Plan. It was from the very beginning, the intent was to have kind of a set of metrics, and that's beginning to be fleshed out, at least from a very broad perspective through our annual report update. We're looking at kind of re-envisioning our annual report and integrating this kind of outcomes evaluation aspect of it. But then every sub-plan, such as the South Florida corridors, we see as having its own set of kind of outcome metrics. And so we've actually haven't had a lot of development of the Livable Frederick Master Plan in terms of metrics at this point in time, because we're kind of at the beginning of that process. And it's such a broadly scoped document. It's kind of difficult to kind of wrap our heads around all of that. But with this one in particular, I think there are some very, relevant and uh, implementable metrics that can be tied to this development as it goes forward. So that is definitely something we want to pursue, and whatever you guys can do to help with us on that front, we would be very anxious to see.
So it sounds like maybe what we can do is come back to you all with, if we've got a set of, we kind of go into this exercise with some preliminary guiding principles or design principles, or general things that have already been identified in the countywide plan. We kind of focus here and say, these are some of the top things. We use the charrette process to confirm that those are the top things in terms of goals or guiding principles. And then we come up with a set of metrics to measure that. So as we're developing kind of different ideas, we can say, all right, well, this redevelopment scheme kind of does great on metrics A, B, and C, but it's not so good on, D, E, and F, or that sort of thing. But it sounds like our first step is to maybe lay out those guiding principles based on what you all have already shared, what's kind of already articulated in the briefing book, and any feedback you have even today about what some of those are. And then we can tell you how we might measure those so that we're using that as our benchmark through the workshop process. How does that sound?
That makes a lot of sense. The one kind of detail I'd mention is that this South Frederick corridor's planning area is quite large, and some approaches are more kind of applicable than in some areas than they are in other areas. For example, the southern portion of the South Frederick corridors likely will involve somewhat more conventional, for lack of a better word, planning and zoning approaches, whereas the northern portion in the South Frederick Triangle will likely look at some more innovative and sort of new approaches at trying to make a more urban style environment. So, there's going to be differentiation of approaches throughout the plan.
Hey, John, this is Carl. Just a couple of comments. Kate, Caroline, welcome to the team. It's obvious to me that you guys have quite an expertise of herding cats, so good luck with this show. Kate, I'm glad you brought up the one, how do we look at a matrix? How do we, move forward on that? And one of the things that John and the rest of the group have talked about early on in this process is what's that balance between commercial development and residential development, and what makes a strong community? There's got to be a percentage out there that says, okay, as long as you hit these benchmarks, you're going to be a strong community, moving forward. So I'd be very curious to understand that.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually I'm going to call it very relevant and emerging area of practice right now, and a lot of it comes down to that balance of housing and jobs. A lot of that has to do with your goals around promoting alternatives to transportation. And what I mean by that is the more balance you have within close proximity to each other. So if somebody's living really close to where maybe they can shop or they can work, all of a sudden you can live slightly more car light or car free lifestyles, those sorts of things. So the balance and the mix, creating a there's all sorts of kind of co-benefits that go along with that. So I'm not sure that there's like a perfect balance rule of thumb per se, but if we define, for instance, that, hey, in the northern part of this corridor, we really do want to promote more transit use, more walking and biking on a daily basis, and that's going to lead you to want to have a really rich mix so that you're getting that balance of origins and destinations. Whereas in other places, maybe you're really trying to create much more of a just pure jobs hub, and that would have kind of a different connotation as it relates to transportation options. But we can certainly kind of tee some of those up and talk about best practices as to what that balance looks like, and then the different metrics that go behind that, if you will.
I would kind of piggyback on that and say that I suspect that this idea of a ratio between different land uses would be different based on the overarching kind of strategies about how these places would develop, whether it's a more jobs emphasis area or residential emphasis area. But the idea of thinking about a mix, at this maybe sub level, I think could be very useful.
Mm-hmm. So what other sorts of plan elements, whether it's access to open space, housing affordability or housing mix, are there other kind of goals that you guys are thinking in the back of your mind, or guiding principles that we should be bringing forward so that we can maybe evaluate ways to measure, or targets that we're looking for with concepts here?
I think one big one that is kind of like in the background as we're moving forward with this is implementation of some of these ideas. We don't have a lot of concrete illustrations of what the plan would propose at this point in time, so people kind of can imagine different scenarios, and some of the scenarios may be more realistic than other scenarios. So kind of understanding the feasibility, financial, and in terms of government investment of these various options would be, I think, an important element to consider. I wouldn't want to have that kind of pull in our ability to think imaginatively and kind of fantasize about what the future should be, because, you know, even if it's super long term, we still need to have kind of an idea of what we want this community to be in a way that supports sort of our needs and our desires. But in terms of how long and when those things get implemented over time, that might be kind of a consideration relative to the kind of the realities of the different dynamics at play in terms of development. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So I'm hearing that we want to allow for the concepts to go big, you know, just what's possible. What do we really want if money wasn't an issue, or maybe, but then that needs to be scaled a little bit to the practicalities of what can be achieved maybe over the next 30 years, or maybe it's a 10 years. So maybe we need to put a timeline on it, which is to say, okay, we've got this big picture vision, but then we scale that back and say, okay, but what's got to happen in the next 10 years? And how does that align with some of the existing market demand that's out there? City investments in terms of, and state investments perhaps in terms of infrastructure, those sorts of things. Not that this is a detailed study of all that, but at least making sure that during the conversation about what can be, that we're couching some of that against those things, or maybe by the end of the process, we've got the big, bold vision, but then we kind of figure out, well, what is the implementation strategy over the next 10 years, 20 years?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Kelly, can I jump in real quick? I'm a city elected official, and all of this occurs just outside the corporate limits of the city of Frederick. So what I'm interested in is how can this planning process provide some synergy with the city of Frederick so that it enhances the area without competing with the area?
Mm-hmm. Very helpful. Okay.
Yeah. I also agree with Kelly that the connection to the city is very important. And I think the other thing we see in this area is there's a lot of stratification in terms of the northern and the south, and the west and the east, with the south being a little more open space and rural oriented. And on the west side, you see a lot more residential neighborhoods. There's not a good integration there currently for the kind of walkability and the goals that we're looking for. So, way to create a core that sort of bridges those areas and works effectively towards the goals, I think, can be important.
Very helpful.
So this is Mark. It's been projected that the county will grow by approximately 40,000 residents in the next 20, 25 years or so. So we do have some housing in this quarter, like was just mentioned, and we've been talking about that a little bit. So since there is already substantial infrastructure in this area, one of my goals would be to see more housing integrated in this area somehow. It's going to work more easily in some areas than others, but certainly I think there's some portions of this quarter or quarters that would be amenable to more mixed use types of applications and more denser housing. And certainly we need to take into account providing diverse price ranges from low to modest income types of homes, to high-end homes. So there's a lot of choice for folks as they move into this area. But certainly for me, as an affordable housing advocate, I think it's important to understand that many of the people already working here are probably in the ALICE category of folks, to modest to low incomes, particularly folks working in retail and restaurants. So it would be beneficial to everyone, I think, to have those options available for folks to live in proximity to where they work. And of course, along with that, transit's important, walkability is important, and along with all the environmental issues of open space and, parks, etc.
And if I may, I'd love to echo some of what I just heard. Certainly, transit and walkability are hugely important, especially when it comes to access to our national park, which is on the southern border of our study area. And certainly at present, there's insufficient access for people who don't have personal vehicles. So just thinking through if we'd prefer to think of success or engagement as part of the plan as things like more access to green space or 10% more linear sidewalk footage. That's where I was thinking earlier. Planner brain, trying to figure out which path.
Great. So can I just maybe ask a follow-up, and maybe this is back to the synergy between kind of what happens here and what happens in the city of Frederick. When we say things like we want to be sure that they're synergistic or complementary in terms of the type of uses and the economic impact, is there a differentiation that you guys already have in mind in terms of the real focus for those adjacent areas for the city of Frederick and kind of what happens there, the flavor of both jobs and housing versus what you're seeing out here and maybe the type of jobs? Has there been much discussion about already different kind of flavors of, if you will, employment uses or things like that?
Hey, Kate, this is Carl again. One of the questions that was asked in the 7-page document is, should the corridor have its own personality, right? Different sections have its own personality. And I personally think that's a great question, because if you look at what is physically in place today, on the east side, on the northeast side, you've got a quarry. That quarry is going to be there for who knows how long, right? On the south side, you've got rail, you've got another quarry. So you've got kind of landmarks that already spot the corridor. So I think we need to be sensitive to, what's going to be happening with those physical existing features, and how do we, think about the development in and around those specific items. So that's why I think this personality thing, I think that's perfect. As you look at the corridor, it's like Mark Rail. If that ever becomes a light rail, that changes the entire dynamics of that segment of the corridor. So I like the personality thing. I think that makes a lot of sense.
So maybe one of the first things is we just kind of start to define those existing assets, physical, social, cultural, that are there today, and see if that starts to tell us a story about what that personality could pivot from in terms of the future, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Great. All right. Any other plan ideas? Because I know Caroline's got some outreach process things we want to talk to today as well. Is there any other ideas that have been bubbling around, or questions that you guys have asked in this meeting before about what can happen in this area, or what should happen in the area?
I apologize. I joined late. I had a conflicting meeting, so I didn't hear the whole conversation. But I just wanted to expand on the comments earlier about the city and this planning area, because I think it's important that the connectivity isn't purely physical. I think the goal is for it to be more than just a physical connection. So I just wanted, I don't know if anybody covered that already, my apologies, but I just wanted to offer that.
Could you maybe elaborate a little more on what you mean? Is there is it an identity of people who live there, businesses? Maybe expand a little bit more on that.
So I don't know that I know you, but my job is I'm the executive director of Downtown Frederick Partnership. So I work all the time to support Downtown Frederick as a place. And so the goal, I think the conversation of Carl about personality is really good because it should have a separate personality from downtown Frederick. But there also is ways that those two places could reinforce each other. I don't know that I can completely clearly define it, but they can reinforce each other in ways that aren't just vehicular and pedestrian movement, and the business choices that are there in the way that the two areas connect and support each other. Hopefully that's adding a little bit more substance to a very kind of amorphous idea.
Very helpful.
One kind of very concrete approach to that has always stuck in my mind. I think maybe it was Kara that mentioned it at the beginning, was the idea of having a joint organization between the South Frederick corridors, or maybe portions of the South Frederick corridors, and downtown Frederick, to create some kind of a continuity of communication between the two areas.
So I think what I'm hearing is that this whole process, at least the charrette kind of workshop, it shouldn't just deal with the physical aspects. I mean, what should come out of this are some of these the soft infrastructure that's needed to maybe promote and make redevelopment and kind of bring all this together. So thinking about the people infrastructure, I guess, is what I'm hearing, and some of those joint organizations, or the need for new joint organizations to kind of bridge that gap.
And I would say I'm not always the biggest fan of calling for new organizations because we have it's like 2,500 nonprofits in Frederick already. But I do think the point of communication and collaboration is one that definitely should be emphasized. And I don't know that I'd spell out the form, because who knows what will happen, but the genesis of achieving it.
I had one more thought. At least for me, I don't know if others feel this way, but I'd be very much interested or getting some input on transitions. We've talked about this as a large area. It may have different, characters or personalities and so forth as we look toward developing different areas. So what are some of the natural transitions, that make that effective? I think sometimes I've seen areas developed and the changes can be so abrupt between, areas, and sometimes that can lead to some, not failure of the whole thing, but failure of portions of it. Okay, so if you know of strategies or things we should be aware of, I think that would be great to hear about.
Great. No, I think that's good.
Okay, should we
All right,
move on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great.
Carolyn.
Okay, that was really, really great feedback. Thank you all. I had lots of ideas in my head, but I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the more specific elements of what we're imagining for this type of outreach and engagement. So first, I just wanted to give sort of a big picture overview of the way this is structured in the way that we proposed it. So it would be a 2-week or 3 sessions over 2 weeks. These would be virtual sessions accompanied by some sort of self-guided element that folks could work through if they're unable to attend the live session. So the first session would be what we're calling sort of a listen and learn. This would be, similar to kind of the conversation that we just had, giving folks an opportunity to tell us, what the challenges and opportunities are in the corridor, and for us to sort of start to conceptualize some of what we're hearing into some kind of, like vision map, something a little more conceptual that we can all look at and gather around to discuss as we move into sort of the next session, which is designing with the community. One of the things we're hoping to come out of the first session with is several focus areas that we can sort of zoom in on and think about, what sort of the characteristic type of design elements might be present in those areas, and then sort of thinking about, as you all were discussing, ways to kind of visually and psychologically connect the corridor as a whole, even though these areas do have their own sort of personalities and character. There's definitely, approaches for creating kind of that unified big picture character, but also allowing enough room for each of these areas to sort of express their own individuality. And then in the third session, which would be, we were hoping to build in about a week in between the two sets of sessions, which would give us a little time to go back to the actual drawing board and start to get some of this down into more of a graphic format. And then we can bring some conceptual designs back for, maybe things that are representative of the different character areas in the corridor. Start thinking about those transitions between different places and, steps in sort of the evolution of the growth of the corridor through into the future. So just thinking about where we are right now and where we want to get to, about 6 weeks is sort of the minimum we need to get ready and make sure there's enough time for outreach to let folks know what's going on. Start, developing and implementing some strategies for inviting people who we definitely want to make sure can be at the table, doing some advertising and some creative approaches for outreach and getting some people excited and involved. And then, another 1 to 2 weeks for us to set up our materials and get everything ready. Facilitating the virtual events over that 3-week period. We have used Zoom in the past as a platform. It's worked pretty well for us. One, it allows for pre-registration, so folks have to register if they intend to participate in the event, which provides a level of security for the event, so we're not getting uninvited guests who are disruptive. It also allows us to kind of track, our SVPs and see if we're getting a good response to the events. It also has some fun functions, like it lets us break out into smaller groups, which I think could be useful, particularly for this type of small area where you do have these kind of distinct, different types of places within the larger area that, people might want to discuss or have ideas about. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to kind of build this self-guided element that, maybe will be a pre-recorded presentation and some sort of way for folks to provide feedback if they're unable to make the live events, just to make sure we can capture as many folks as possible. So the first thing that, we start to do and we'll work with the county and you all to do is to think about, who needs to be there. And what we've done in the past, this is an example from down in Florida, where we worked with the community and, we're starting to think about all these different people who we want to make sure we can invite. How is the corridor used? Who is using it? What are the different perspectives we need to make sure we're getting? So we'll work with the county to, discuss an approach for outreach, discuss an approach for reaching different portions of the population, and then sort of check in to measure our success at reaching these different segments of the population as we move forward. Just a little sort of sneak peek at what a virtual session might look like or result in. So this is one we did recently in Douglas, Arizona. We set it up similarly where we had some preliminary early sessions where we did a lot of listening and getting feedback about the area. We did a lot of hands-on activities via the Zoom platform, which was really great. And then one of the products that we were able to sort of end up with was this growth and connectivity framework for this particular community for these two sort of facilities that they were trying to to provide some connections between, and making sure that one wasn't pulling too much away from the other, which I think is sort of resonant in that. Similarly here, we don't want to pull too much away from the city proper, but make sure that everybody is building off each other. And then these are some other examples for things that we've done in terms of conceptual designs. So on the left is just sort of a streetscape. This is something we might think about in terms of, what does the corridor evolve into in the future? This one on the left is sort of an ultimate state. This isn't where you end up tomorrow. This is kind of the longer term vision, what you're building towards. And there were 4 other steps that, kind of got us to that final streetscape. And then on the right was, sort of an underused connection between a town facility that was a dock and then the downtown, where they were really trying to, bring people from one to the other, but was sort of just this underused road. In a way that we worked with the community to kind of visualize this, multi-use street that, was more people focused and active transportation focused rather than, just kind of this sad little street that nobody really traveled down much. So again, that's sort of the big picture, what you're working towards. This is more the aspirational vision, and there's a lot of steps in between. But this is sort of the stuff we're hoping to come back with to at least give a flavor of what these different parts of different focus areas along the corridor could potentially evolve into. So there's a couple things that we wanted to get a little bit of feedback on, just because this is your community and you know it best. We were talking about potentially doing scheduling towards late March, early April, which would give us enough time to prep. There is a week in between there. I think it's the week of the 29th. That is sort of the nationwide, spring break week. So we should probably stay away from that, just because I think folks probably have, family responsibilities and may not be in their offices as much, things like that. But things that are important for us to know are, are there days of the week that seem to work well for most people? Are there times that seem to work better for meetings, mornings, afternoons, evenings? Should we maybe try and vary the times? If we do one meeting in the morning, should we do another one in the afternoon or the evening, so that we're capturing different groups? Thinking a little bit about the format of the different events, whether these are sort of more casual drop-in style, or if we want to have more of a scheduled agenda for each of the events. And then different outreach roles and ways to share information. One of the best ways for us to reach more people is for all of you to sort of work your own networks and bring as many people in as possible, and then try and recruit those folks to let other people know, and just build on our own networks, as well as doing public outreach as much as we're able to.
Hey, Caroline. Sorry to interrupt you. Is there a kind of a limit to how many people can participate in this sort of event, an outer limit?
Yeah, so if we think that we're going to have more than 200 people on a session, we can talk about doing a webinar format, which allows up to 500. It doesn't, the functionality is a little different between those two virtual platforms. There's some trade-offs as far as how much people can interact during the event, but we can kind of give you some options for the different sort of scales of participation. Did you have a number in mind, maybe, or ballpark?
No,
Yeah.
not really. I just was thinking if there is a limit, we need to kind of factor that into our outreach process in terms of asking people to participate. But if we can go up to 200, I feel like we're not going to have an issue with sort of needing to limit, participation.
Kelly, can I just jump in real quick? all of this outreach involves people with computers and cameras and all of that technology. And so how
Sure
do
does.
you reach the other segments of the population?
It's a good question. So, one thing that we are going to do is to not have sort of, we will have a self-guided option. I know, again, it still requires a computer. I would be hopeful that there's ways to perhaps work with folks in the community who have that access, whether it's social service providers or other groups who are connecting with community members who can perhaps bridge that gap a little bit. We would need to talk again with the county a little more closely to better understand, their capacity to do on the ground sort of outreach. There's strategies, but we would probably need to sort of work out a plan for that.
Yeah, the other thing that we could do, John, I think this is maybe a little bit out of maybe what we pitched, but as I'm hearing kind of that question and thinking this through a little bit, is we're working on a project right now in Charleston, and we're doing this big virtual charrette, but we're also going to have kind of an open house drop-in at the kind of client's office, so that as that event's going on, people could stop in person. There could be some boards there. And that could be something maybe at a staff level that, we could still have that. It wouldn't be the same event, but it would be a place where, again, if somebody can't participate and they're just more comfortable coming and seeing something hard and tangible, we could do more of an open house, but it's staffed by kind of county staff or something like that.
We have a supply of hyperbaric chambers for staff, so we should be fine. No, I mean, I think that sounds like a good idea. Obviously, with masks and social distancing and whatnot.
Right.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and we can talk more about this, but ways to sort of provide static information in hard copy format, and have an alternative way, whether it's somebody's phone number that folks can call in and give feedback, or text or something like that. There's ways to set up things like that as well.
So the
it's
only
just
other thing,
yeah.
Caroline, yeah, that I was just going to jump in. I'm pretty sure you all have, at least back when we worked with you before, pretty good public access TV in terms of, that's already putting some things online. So if there's a way that we can connect to that, maybe there's, some, again, static, but at least then folks that have television access could see something that's going on as well. So I think that's another communication venue we could consider.
Actually, we're using a application called publicinput.com, and all of our committee meetings, we can kind of receive calls. People can watch the meeting through the TV or through a live stream, and then they can call in like a radio show style format. So that might be one means of doing that if people have access to a television and a telephone.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Any thoughts on sort of like timing or days of the week, or ideas about that? I mean, I tend to stay away from Mondays and Fridays just because those are the days that, if people are going to take off, they're going to take off.
John,
So-
when you guys did Livable Frederick, what was the most attendance that you had?
Well, we did a variety of different things early on. We had daytime meetings with the planning commission, and then as the plan was developed and we kind of took it on the road show, that was much more evening-based meetings. With the fact that it's virtual now, I hesitate to say that people could potentially attend a meeting during the day, assuming they could take an hour or two out of their schedule. They could at least, access it virtually. Like the benefit of having a late night meeting I think lies in the fact that people can drive back home and their work day is done. But a virtual meeting may not have that many kind of obstacles. And if we could do it during the day, I think in some respects that might help people.
Is each meeting offered once, or is it offered more than one time? Because I think for professionals and for some businesses, it would be easier during the day, and for residents, it would be easier in the evening.
Yeah, and I think we'd have to pick because we can't replicate because we've got the 3 sessions we're proposing, kind of session 1, session 2, session 3, and what I was thinking is maybe one way to do it so that because we can't duplicate both 2 meetings in one day, but we could have the daytime and then there's like an evening broadcast of it with the ability for people to have feedback but not have live feedback or something like that. Well, maybe we could take just one big step back because I know Caroline showed the big circle with the who. As you all think about this particular area of the county and you think about the existing uses and who really has both a vested interest but just is going to want to be engaged, it would seem to me that it may lean a little bit more towards the business community simply because there's so much commercial out there. So maybe daytime can work. What do you guys think of that? Or should we mix it up? Should we have one session during the day and one in the evening and the other, late afternoon or something like that?
This is Rick with the Chamber of Commerce. We try to mix up all of our events where we want to gather an interesting and diverse group of people. So even my networking events, which is sort of the heart of the Chamber, B2B networking, now they're all virtual, but we schedule morning, we schedule lunchtime, and we schedule in the late afternoon, early evening. And we do that routinely. We did it back when all our events were live, and we continue to do it now in a virtual environment. The evening, late afternoon, early evening events are always larger, but there clearly is a segment of that community that we're talking about now that would probably appreciate a midday or coffee-based early morning opportunity if that could be accommodated.
Okay, so I think we're hearing all times of day would be preferred, multiple meetings. So I think we'll come back with a proposal, John. We can kind of follow up and share some ideas. And I think, again, maybe one way to accomplish this is to really think about the good thing about trying to do this with all of our new virtual tools is that it does give you a lot of different opportunities to, rebroadcast or kind of have this hybrid-based approach. So I think we come back to you guys with some ideas based on what we've heard.
Yeah, and I'm sort of hopeful too that, maybe we can build in some ways to get feedback before the events or even after the events, whether it's through social media or, if you all want to sort of take this and bring it out bigger to the public through something like a survey, there's lots of ways that we can sort of build a more inclusive approach to get more feedback before and after. But that, I think, is really the crux of our approach. So I think we just wanted to get some feedback and hear if you all had any ideas or, ways that you can think of to sort of drum up some participation or, things that have worked in the past. Just generally, if there's something you feel is missing.
In terms of getting kind of relevant attendance, I wonder if like the scoping group members would be comfortable with kind of identifying 2 or 3 people that they know that might be interested in participating to kind of generate a list of invitees I think it could help make this kind of a very diverse group and kind of build up our participation base.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Direct invitations are always really powerful and, tend to get good feedback. So if there's folks that you're connecting with who you know personally, who you think would have a vested interest, there's a much higher rate of them participating if they're getting that personal invitation from someone they know.
So this is
Yeah,
Mark.
I think we've got a dozen members or more down there. I'm happy, including Randy Cohen at the hotel, and so I'm happy to take responsibility to personally invite all the chamber members that are in those corridors 85 and 355.
Excellent.
So this is Mark. In addition to reaching out to individual people who I think may be interested, I also am on the board of directors of a nonprofit called Envision Frederick County. And one of our main missions is to get citizens involved and engaged in civic things. And one of our primary focuses is land use and smart growth and environmental issues. And we have a fairly substantial social media presence and outreach. We could possibly do some blogs on our Facebook and in other ways. We can send direct emails out about this to hype things up. Maybe you, John, would want to do just kind of a generic blog to just lay out what's going on, if you wish. So we can hype this up in multiple ways. And I also have all my housing connections that I can broadcast to.
Excellent.
This is also kind of touches on my concern of what the outer limit of participation might be. Like if we kind of do a blanket advertisement, my concern would be that we get kind of, although this has almost never happened in the history of public outreach and planning.
Yeah.
My concern would be that we'd get too many people. But
it's the best problem to have.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Too many people?
Yeah.
This is Kelly. I feel more comfortable personally with a more broad outreach than me handpicking a few people, because, that could really skew who participates. So
Right. I agree.
Yeah, I think it takes a little of both, for sure. And it looks like y'all have some great connections. Thank you for the suggestions in the chat as well.
I think a really important thing.
Go ahead.
Is just the message that's included in the invitation. This is a big area with a broad topic, and I think for many people there's no sense of urgency, and I don't want to create a false sense of urgency, of course, but I think the case for what happens and why you should get involved really clearly put out there in non-urban planner speak. I'm happy to, I have channels of people, I'm happy to distribute it, but I think the messaging is so important, because otherwise you could think, why do I need to be there?
Mm-hmm. What is the message that you would share if you were crafting this for your folks or the general public, just out of curiosity?
I don't know. But I can say that, I think, and this isn't like, I have a design committee. They're into urban planning issues. I don't have to tell them much. They get it. They got it. They're ready. If I was sending out to the business community, there'd have to be a business case for why is it worth it to my business to spend the 2 seconds I have free on something else. So I think the message is maybe slightly different depending on the consumer you're trying to attract.
Yeah, and I think one thing that might be helpful, and I feel like this is happening across communities everywhere, because obviously we're trying to do a lot of planning in the middle of still a pandemic situation where there's been a lot of business disruption. There's been a lot of just concern about, will things go back to normal? So not to use the pandemic as a sense of urgency, but it is, a lot of communities are kind of hitting a pause right now and asking the big question of, you know, what is the future of retail? What is the future of where people live and work? So one of the ways I would think that we could craft this is to tie it very much so to the current conditions, which is here we have this big part of our county that we're trying to think about for the next, you know, 10 to 30 years. What are some of the things that we're all experiencing, and what are some of the what ifs in terms of how people live, work, and play, given what we've all just been through and are likely to still be going through for a little while now. So again, not to create a false sense of urgency, but I think this is a great time right now where this whole notion of how we define a great community is being talked about even by people who don't talk about these things. So just that's another thought. We can work again, John, with you on some of that, but just really thinking about what makes a great community 10 years from now, based on what we've just all been through, based on what some of the impacts have been to businesses and just all that kind of good stuff. And maybe that'll gen up some interest.
I agree with everything you said, but also when I think about the business community from working with them on a day in, day out basis, they're exhausted. They're completely fried right now. So there's some other, I'm creating yet another thing, sorry, but maybe there's some other mechanism that's really short and sweet, and it takes you like 10 minutes and it gets you some really core information. That's sort of like the short, easy version for those, so you can get information, but it may not be as much as you wanted, but at least it's the time. You've responded to the time they have free. But even that's hard. I'll say we send out surveys all the time and we have to beg for answers at this point.
Yeah.
Something that we've started doing as part of our outreach during the pandemic, because we're not getting sufficient survey responses on any of our efforts, an example is posting an excerpt of a plan in layman's terms at a bus stop and leaving stickers or pens or pencils. So it allows you to still engage with people and gather feedback. It also allows us to not have to rely solely on smartphones or computers. So if there was a way that we could do this, even if dropping off some very basic information at the Community Action Center or at the MARC train station or anything, to help us think through that, just offering up an idea.
Yeah, I would also like to suggest, I hope we make some efforts to bring younger people in, because they're likely to live with the consequences of the decisions made here. And I think oftentimes there's not a sufficient representation of, you know, and there's a lot of people today, a lot of young people who are very much interested in these kinds of issues. So I hope we find creative ways to bring them into this process.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna, I think, try and mine the social media angle as much as possible. And one way of doing that for this type of effort, I think I have it on the screen here, is just, you know, posting something really simple on like Twitter or Instagram, you know, what could be on this corner in 20 years, or what's missing from this picture, and, you know, getting folks to respond, even if it's just in a sentence or a word or something like that. You know, I would love to think of a way to sort of translate that into a quick hit type of feedback for businesses, or, you know, other folks who don't have the time, or, you know, need to be on yet another sort of virtual event. So I think we're definitely going to try and combine as much of this as we are able to sort of, you know, throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, and hopefully we can, you know, hit these different key groups. But we'll come back with some more ideas too for different social media, or, you know, sort of, I'm calling it like arm's length engagement instead of like face to face or hands on. 6 feet distanced engagement, you know, ways that we could perhaps, you know, get feedback from folks without being right there with them, and making it more accessible overall. These are all really great ideas. Yeah, someone mentioned schools. What is do you have a good working relationship with the school district, or are they sort of impenetrable?
The Board of Education is funded by Frederick County government, so it's
Okay.
completely entwined.
Because I do
Yeah,
love
we
the
have-
idea of involving high school students or college students, you know, especially if there's art or design courses or, you know, social studies or civics types of topics. These are all really good ways to grab folks.
Urban planning.
Okay. Kate, anything else on your mind?
No, this has been really helpful. I think
Yeah.
you know we are going to go back to the drawing board a little bit and just nail down some of these things. I think there's you know two big lifts here. First is just developing the content to have an effective charrette, if you will, which means you know the physical transformation of space and figuring out how to organize that, given that we're going to be doing this virtually and some of what we've already heard from you all today. And then the second is just working with staff on the best way to get the biggest bang for our buck, given all of the virtual options we have, but still this need to have kind of some non-virtual engagement to come up with a plan. So really good feedback, and I think we've gotten what we needed today. I think the only other thing, Caroline, I just wanted to flag is the timeline. And, you know, I'm feeling like we may need to push it to the week after spring break. And I just didn't know if you guys had any strong convictions about the timing for this. And remember, what we're trying to do is identify kind of a 2-week. So it's not a one-time event. It's the intent is to hold it over 2 weeks, and we have kind of 3 hands-on, kind of virtual hands-on events. But then over the course of those 2 weeks, we could supplement that with some of the other things that we've been talking about in terms of open house or more kind of static displays at places that are okay for people to visit, if you will.
So that would put the three virtual meetings during the first 2 weeks of April.
Yeah, after the 5th. So yeah, I think that's what we're talking about.
I mean, I think, you know, that is what it is. You know, we have kind of a compressed timeline with our planning commission and our county council. And my hope is that with all this kind of front end work, we'll be able to kind of work quickly with the planning commission. Although I probably just jinxed it by saying that. So, you know, we want this to be a successful and useful event. So, you know, whatever needs to happen in order to do that, I think we can work with.
So I guess, Caroline, the other alternative is before spring break, which would be the weeks of March 15th to the 22nd.
Yeah, which is coming up hot.
It is, yeah. So if you guys are okay, John, I think we would like to target this for the weeks of April 5th and April 12th. And that gives us just a little more time for pandemic, more vaccines out there, and a little more openness perhaps too.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right.
Great. Okay, I think we'll hand it back over to you all then.
Well, thank you guys very much. This was very informative, a good discussion. We're going to move on to kind of a guided discussion of the planning area to try to look at some specific places. Kate and Carolyn, you're welcome to stay on if you like, or if you have other things,
thanks.
feel free to disconnect. But again, we appreciate having you guys here. All right. So, Dennis, do you want to kind of take the lead with this? What I was thinking we could do is I have kind of an aerial map prepared of the planning area, and we have a list of sort of probing questions related to the area. And so I figured we figured we could kind of take each question one at a time and think about it relative to the planning area and perhaps sketch out some implications of those questions. So I am actually going to. Do you need to share any slides, Dennis, or should I share the aerial?
I could share my slide deck, but it's just words, and everybody hopefully has seen it at this point, or at least has a copy they can pull up. So I think the aerial photograph might be a better use of our screen real estate.
Okay.
Or my beautiful face, one or the other. Doesn't matter. And I'm going to cut over to my slide deck so that I can follow along with myself. We're only going to take another 30 minutes of your time, I think, for this, because we had some excellent discussion with our Renaissance folks, and we touched on a lot of the ideas that we put into this little concepts and questions presentation. So as we've discussed over the past few months, various options, the various forces at work in the corridors area, we've touched on a lot of these issues, and there have been times where I think I've wanted the ability to explore a certain question or a certain idea, but we've been kind of like doing something else, so we really couldn't just kind of discuss it. There are a couple of reasons we brought you folks into this work. One is obviously your wisdom and your knowledge of the area and of just things in general, life, business, operations of government, what have you. Another reason we brought you in was alluded to earlier, which is your Rolodexes, or whatever the contemporary digital version of that is, your contact lists, because each of you are connected in so many vital ways to the community that we know we can count on you to not just bring the people that you know or the people that you agree with, but to find ways of getting to the people that we might otherwise miss. So I'm glad we had that. We started to have that discussion a few moments ago. But what I'd like to talk about today are some of the kind of the bigger concepts that we've talked around, or we've alluded to, or in some cases we've dug in a little bit on, and how they kind of affect the corridor. And the first one to talk about really is this whole idea of corridors. So, we titled this study area and this planning effort the South Frederick Corridors. And we had 13 years to come up with a better name, and we really couldn't. So to some extent, we kind of went back to corridors because it kind of made sense. But, if you show somebody an aerial of this area, or you show them a map, it's readily apparent that you have these primary corridors kind of blowing right through the study area. And it's not that other study areas don't have arterial roadways or other kind of corridor-like connections, but this one I think is acutely affected by the corridors that move through it. And one of the neat things for me, at least as a planner, is really each of these corridors has a distinguishable purpose and character and function within this broader study area. I may have mentioned that earlier on when we were kind of looking at a much finer version of this planning process, a much more constrained version where we were focusing mostly on the 85 and the 355 corridors. We looked at ways to differentiate. We looked at ways in which these corridors might be duplicating kind of functional duties. The fact that 355 and 85 are both, state highways, in addition to having I-270 as this interstate. So we've been talking about the nature of this from the beginning. So the first question I think that comes up under this idea of using the arterial corridors as a primary organizing feature of the plan is, should these arterial roadways that run through and in some sense, define the study area, serve as organizing features as we develop physical plans for the South Frederick corridor. There are a lot of ways we can kind of go forward with this, but I think one question we have to you as a group is, what are your thoughts about using these corridors as kind of like not just the name of the plan, but as a primary thematic elements that we can use to hang other ideas upon or from? And this is kind of an open-ended discussion, so anybody feel free to jump in, say what you want.
Well, Dennis, you've known me a long time. I always jump in and say something. So it's, I did read that, and I think it makes a lot of sense to keep or to design around the existing corridors or infrastructure. Especially when you get to the south side. Well, when I looked at this, kind of what I said earlier, I think each of these, I think you could map it out in different grids. And I think each of those different grids has a different personality because of physical characteristics, whatever. So I think it's I think the existing road network can be worked with within those grids. So that's my thoughts.
That's good to hear. I worked on a plan when I was working up in New England where there was a corridor kind of moving through the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, and as this roadway moved through the city, at various points it served as alternatively like the organizing feature, so like a main street with activities on both sides, to an element that was a dividing line or a wall. And I think in our corridors area, it's easiest to see with I-270. It's hard to see I-270, at least at the human level, as being much of a corridor in the sense of kind of inviting both sides or each side to kind of participate in a dance or a discussion, right? I-270 is like a wall, nearly impenetrable if you're not in a car. And even if you're in a car, the only way you penetrate that wall is at an access point. For instance, at Maryland 85, or a little bit further north when you hit the next interchange area. And then you have a corridor like 355, perhaps, and maybe that reads as a corridor that is equal on both sides, or 85 kind of south of the I-270 corridor, where we have a lot of industrial uses on one side of the road, on the east side, and on the west side of the road, we have this burgeoning, commercial retail and office world that has developed. So I like the idea of the corridors as organizing features. And I think it's important that as we move forward, we think about, how we can differentiate them from each other and where this serves the purpose of helping us create a cohesive planning document. And that comes back to that whole personality concept too. I think it's pretty clear from this group that we all put a lot of value in the personality of place. And we have some extremely wonderful examples in Frederick County, mostly positive, where an area can have its own personality, and that's defined in many ways. If we're looking at a corridor, that can be the experience of traveling along that corridor. It can be whether you're walking it in a car, in a bus, on a train. It can be the land uses that surround you, the design of the built environment, or the lack thereof. So I would ask to the group, is there value in continuing to think about these corridors as having different personalities?
Hey, Dennis.
I'll just jump in and say, sorry. So what comes to mind for me is our Golden Mile being an example of a corridor like that, but there are also downfalls if you're bisecting it. It can, like Route 15 bisects the city of Frederick. So I think you have to be very cognizant of making sure that if both sides are playing, that they're connected somehow, that that there's a cohesive way to get from here to there, and that they relate.
Excellent point.
Yeah, corridors could be, dividing elements, or they could actually be elements that attract people, and like kind of joints between two different sectors. And I think these probably have a lot of potential for serving that latter purpose. One other thing I wanted to just kind of mention is sort of the sphere of influence of some of these elements. Like, if we think of it in terms of scale, the 85 corridor and the 355 corridor have kind of a scale that extends beyond the planning area, and they connect to different types of activities. Like 355 connects Monocacy, connects downtown historic Frederick, whereas 85 connects a lot of business activity. And then beyond those two corridors, in terms of scale, there's kind of a need for a cross connection through the site to connect kind of the west side to the east side, beyond the site. And that's another thing to potentially think about. How do we create this cross connectivity that can really lead from this western side through the corridors and connect over to the eastern side, which can also kind of help reinforce the functionality of the MARC station, which is located right there.
I'll just make one quick comment. I'm working on the corridors team for M.MTA in Baltimore City. And when we're undertaking outreach with the community and we use the phrase corridors, people immediately think of shipping or freight or just highways. They don't necessarily associate it with places that people want to live or work or play or visit. This is something we're learning the hard way. So I'm wondering, I, of course, am a proponent of using the word corridor, but if we could adjust the way we present it or even the way we phrase or approach it when we're thinking about the public, it'll be less of that roadway aspect and more of that communal basis. A lot of folks thought we were creating massive shipping lanes through Baltimore when we started.
I told one of my friends about this plan, and he told me bluntly, when I hear the word corridor, I just think of high school, like a hallway. Apparently in his school, they called them the corridors. So I always have to keep that in mind now. It's like, oh man, there might be like, and he was not a particularly great student, so his memories were not positive. Yeah, and I think something else to consider is, obviously there's something that's really crucial running through all of this. Part of what we need to do with this plan is find ways in which we can change the planning area in a positive way moving into the future without necessarily screwing up the good parts that we have now. And I think that's sufficiently not urban plannery, so that people can understand that we have something that's pretty good. It needs work. We could definitely make it better. How do we get there? And in terms of the marketplace, one of the concerns and kind of exciting aspects of this plan for me is how the work that we do might influence the market for specific land uses, or change the way in which landowners and developers might view the growth potential in the corridors. And I'm curious as to what you have to think of, what you all think about this, both the positives and the negatives.
I like the conversation around corridors either being the middle or the edge, depending on the physicality. But I think I appreciate that that's not the right name, and I kind of think when you name these little planning segments, whatever they physically end up being, like people understand 270 is a boundary, but I think the name of these little sub areas within the plan should reflect the goal of the personality in some way. I think of, well, I cringe when I read them, but I also know what they mean. You know, Esri does all those little like, you know, upwards millennial or others. I don't know. I don't love them, but you know immediately what they're talking about. And I don't have to be an urban planner. I'm kind of thinking about something along those lines if you are needing to name these like sub areas as a way to communicate the potential and the vision.
Sure, that's a great point. It's sort of the way I keep looking at this, Dennis, is you're sort of giving people the ability to eat the elephant in pieces by helping them understand how all these pieces are interconnected, but how they can be a little bit different. And I think as we're reaching out to the public, we're going to need to do this because we've all stated that this is such a large area.
Yeah, no doubt. And I you know, I think John, maybe you had in one of your early presentations superimposed some kind of known spaces on top of the South Frederick corridors area. I know you've done it before with other presentations over the years, and it's, you know, I'm a planner and I kind of deal with this every day, and I'm always surprised when people place like, you know, or here's a great example for people, right? Everybody who grows up in this area ends up having family visit and ending up in downtown DC, right? Hey, I'm gonna go see the Washington Monument. I'm gonna go see the Capitol. Um, Maybe not so much anymore, but like everybody wants to see like the big federal highlights, and you take them down there. And I think in people's minds, if you grow up in California or Minnesota or Texas, you picture the federal core kind of very much compressed. You don't realize it's like whatever, a mile and three quarters between the Lincoln Memorial and the foot and the steps of the Capitol. It's just it's a great experience to demonstrate how physical spaces really change when you're there, and how your perception, how the place of your imagination can be oftentimes be different. So I like the idea of differentiating areas, or, you know, routes or pathways or places or characteristics that define, not necessarily limited to the physical ways in which we define the area, but maybe in terms of their traits or characteristics. I think that's really crucial for this area to make it more understandable, not just for kind of normal people, but planner geeks as well. Because, you know, the whole elephant, despite being a vegetarian, the whole elephant metaphor is perfect. You know, in order to really understand this and kind of, you know, be able to fit this bite in your mouth, you've really got to cut it up a little bit in order to make it work. So I do appreciate that. And I guess this is more of and this is something I would hope we could deal with a little bit in the charrette. And it's a much more practical, kind of down to earth thing to think about. But how do these arterial roadways, you know, New Design Road, 85, 355, I-270, how do these roads influence the rest of the street network within the South Frederick corridor? I mean, and just to kick off a little discussion on this one, I think those of us in the planning office have always looked at the need to maybe repurpose some of the roadways in this area, maybe adding to the network, maybe subtracting from it in some places. But I'm curious for the group, how you see the connection between how we treat these arterial roadways, um, how that actually influences the rest of the street network, and not just for cars, but for everybody else. Does anybody have any thoughts about how that might impact developability of underutilized or repurposed land in the area from the standpoint of land development, for instance?
Well, you know, as you've been speaking, I have been wondering, you know, it's hard to divorce some of these conversations from economic trends or even economic development initiatives. And I'm not trying to comment on whether what has been transforming in Rockville is correct or good or what we want. I am just saying that these large box stores with big parking lots have been because they wanted more walkable community, have been transforming in these parking lots. They've been developing them and putting other buildings and things of that nature. So, you know, it's hard for me to have a conversation about what to do with the roads if we don't yet talk about what is the vision. Do we see the big box stores remaining 10 years hence, 15 years hence? How do we see that redeveloping? And therefore, those traffic ways, how do they need to evolve? Do they need to be more walkable? Does it need to be bike lanes? What do we do to make it safe that people can cross? I mean, you know, until we have, I think, the vision of what the neighborhood or the personality or character is, for me anyway, it's hard to address some of your questions about, you know, the roadways and all of that.
Yeah, Dennis, I would piggyback on that. I think those are really good comments. I would, way I looked at this is almost dividing the corridors up into neighborhoods, right? So if you divide it into specific neighborhoods or proposed neighborhoods, I think that gives you a better feel as to what the road network or which neighborhood should be walkable, what should not, and so forth. So I think if you take the time to divide it into a neighborhood, I think for me it became a lot more clear.
Right, me too.
Yeah, I agree. Anybody else on the corridors or roads or streets or any further thoughts on that idea? If not, let's take on one more topic here, which is economic prosperity. This is a massively rhetorical question, but should the focus of the SFC be calibrated to favor employment opportunities in the study area? And this is it's a loaded question politically. There are probably absolutely zero elected officials who would want to see a plan that did not result in some kind of job creation or job retention. But for Frederick County and looking at the South Frederick corridors area, it's a vital question because we have a couple of things kind of hanging in the balance. One, we have a lot of jobs located in the greater study area, and there's a range of jobs. It's not just retail and services. There are some other employment opportunities in the area right now, let alone what we might imagine in the future. And then I think secondarily, not necessarily in order, but another thing that we have to think about while we're doing this has been brought up multiple times, which is the city of Frederick and the downtown area, and what can we do to complement and not just add jobs or not just add opportunities in the South Frederick corridors area, but how can we do this in a really smart and mature way such that we don't kind of ruin and hopefully enhance what we already have immediately adjacent to this area. So the first question coming out of this is, should jobs and employment potential be the primary guiding factor or a primary factor in developing a plan for the South Frederick corridors area?
But I think it should certainly be a primary focus. I mean, it's already a vital economic area, and we certainly don't want to diminish that, and hopefully we can enhance that in whatever we do.
I agree with Mark. It's essential. And unless we collectively envision some other corridor that replaces that, the nature of what it is we're dealing with, I think it would be an act of extreme irresponsibility to not at least recognize the importance of, employment opportunity in that corridor.
And it's, sorry. I think it's informative to know that as we have these discussions about employment and job opportunities, as we've discussed before this, we're at this pivot point perhaps in terms of not only how the economy kind of rebounds from our COVID experiences as we eventually kind of pull out of this, but we also at the same time have this whole thing to deal with or to wrestle with, which is like what's happening to retail, brick and mortar retail. What does that look like going forward? And we are faced with making a plan at a time when we may not know what the long range impacts of the previous year have been. So at least from the retail services and restaurants and things like that, it'll be very interesting to me to watch how this develops and to hear how people how people feel about this.
One thing I would just add is, I don't know that we'd want to do anything to diminish economic activity. To me, the question is there things that can be done that differentiate it or create more variety, or especially since we don't know the future of retail, it's a heavy retail driven area. So part of it should be, is there infrastructure things? Are there other considerations that then would attract other kinds of, commercial activity to keep the vitality of the area going?
Dennis, I was really interested in the preamble that you just gave, because I think the first question I would ask you and John based on that preamble is, and how is that any different than any other long-range plan you've ever done in your career, right?
Yeah.
Simply, as brilliant as I consider you two guys, you lack omniscience and you know what I mean, unlimited foresight. So it feels like some of this has to be written into the plan, right? Whether we're suggesting what happens when FSK Mall is no longer viable, because I think that could happen in the timeline that we're talking about. I think the better way to address that is recognizing that there will be continuing consumer demand changes in terms of how people interact with brick and mortar retail. And then making sure at the highest level we give thought to what that might look like without necessarily spelling out preach demise and the fact that when I go down there, it's empty, because that's the condition that we're facing, and I suspect that will accelerate as time goes by. But in the year we have to do this work, maybe best just text descriptions of potential, future events based on continuing consumer demand without necessarily talking about what goes on the footprint of FSK Mall when it's no longer viable.
Yeah, I agree with Rick. I wasn't specifically about the mall, but I was just thinking about retail, and the pandemic in many ways has accelerated trends that were already happening in retail. And retail is going to, even if there was no pandemic, retail would be changing. It's always changing. And I think most industries are as well. So being too bought into a particular concept, I think would be dangerous. So I think we just need to express the fact that things will change, and here's how the plan would like to see that addressed.
Personally, I kind of think that's one of the reasons why an emphasis on form and physical character could be a very useful approach, and have less of an emphasis on specific uses, within reason. And because, if the form creates a type of environment that people want to inhabit, then people are going to kind of have attachments to that place. It's going to be a pleasurable place to be for people who, potentially live there, who want to visit there. And forms or different uses can occur within a variety of forms. Like there's nothing about the kind of the big parking lot in front of the big box that is natural law about how to accommodate that type of use. And so if we can maybe focus on like these targeted areas where the physical form creates places that are kind of more inhabitable, not just by cars, but by people, by residences, and then kind of lean off the actual usage of property, I think that could go a long way towards providing that flexibility of use in the future.
John, I completely agree with all of that. And so my question is, how do you work with the commercial entities that depend so much on their form as their branding? You know, we've seen in the city, new development comes in and the car wash has to look exactly like this, or the Target has to look exactly like this. So how are we going to, like, how do we start to orchestrate that shift from the branding to a more, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is whether or not we choose as a community to say that we are going to allow our community to be have the character that comes from the people who are sort of doing the development, or whether or not the people in the community also want to have a say in what the character of the community is. And, I think there's a balancing act there. I think that from a design perspective, you can find a middle ground that can help create that sort of cohesiveness across parcels. And I don't think you have to really do a ton in order to create that. Like I think there can be continuous design elements throughout. If streets were designed in a certain way that created continuity across parcels, but that could also support walking and biking. Um, not every street, but most, the important streets that kind of would be these centers of activity that have this kind of approach. And, there would have to be compromise. We can't, I, I'm kind of surprised that, communities don't sort of have more of a, interest or express more of resistance to these sort of branding types that come in. I mean, I would think that people live here. This is their home, and I would think that they would want to have an influence on how this gets built out and gets developed, and hopefully we can tap into that.
I think people do. I think where it falls down is in the regulatory structure. We can't tell you that you can't build a McDonald's that has a golden arch. So how do you regulate that kind of a thing?
Well, I
So
mean,
some of it gets down to sort of nitty gritty.
Form-based codes is kind of like a pretty effective tool. What form-based codes does is it regulates design according to geography, not according to specific land uses. So an extensive geography will have design requirements, and then the land uses are kind of disassociated from that. And if we come up with a regulation that says your building frontage has to be at a certain point, you have to have certain features on your building frontage. You have this kind of height range to build within. These are not really stringent regulations necessarily, but they add up, across parcel to parcel to create a place that's more cohesive and more orderly. I mean, what's kind of happening now is, every single parcel is its own little world to some extent and does whatever, is required of it in a rational way. But when you add all that up, it turns into this really kind of thing that's perceived as being jumbled and kind of incoherent and messy and really not kind of the type of environment that people want to inhabit, at least not for in a pleasurable way. They kind of want to get in and get out as quickly as possible for the most part. But if we had these kind of like regulations, like form-based code, that kind of helped create this continuity across parcels, which we've never really had, I think that could go a long way.
I do think we have to recognize that the more form we require, the more density we require, the more mixed use we require. There are in these, certainly in the northern areas, a lot of older structures and infrastructure where they do use the land poorly, but as soon as you start developing in a different way, the tax value is going to begin to force them out because they're there because they had the resources they needed at a cheaper rate than they would in other places. So we have to, I think, be cognizant that that's going to happen.
Another thing to consider too, as we talk about the form of some of the existing uses out there, is that most of the companies that we're dealing with in this corridor on the retail side have demonstrated that they're fully capable and willing to build other models. And I remember my grandfather was an auto worker. I remember the first time he described the idea of just-in-time delivery, the idea that his plant didn't have to store 3 months worth of like body panels for the left rear quarter panel of a truck or whatever, that they could get the pieces as they needed them on the assembly line such that they weren't using their precious real estate to just store stuff. And so when the just-in-time concept came to big box retail, which is essentially what you have. With big box retail, you have this combination of the store being the warehouse and also kind of a just-in-time delivery model where they know they're going to go through so much toilet paper in a given normal month or normal year, non-pandemic week, or non-snow week. And so they know that they need on Tuesday, they know that they need that with whatever it is, 7 pallets of toilet paper so that they can get it onto their shelves. So that model isn't necessarily much different than the way retail seems to be changing kind of universally for everybody. I mean, the use of our current distribution networks, UPS, FedEx, Postal Service, and so on, to deliver stuff to everybody's home. I think I get my coffee now delivered to my house, which is embarrassing to me in some way, but it's because I can't get it at my local grocery store. But I mean, it just shows up when I need, it's like, oh, I've got like 3 days worth of coffee beans left. And ta-da, here comes the FedEx guy. He's got my package with that, which has coffee beans. And so we get some other household stuff in that. So it's not unreasonable to think that retail, in terms of the building form, could change over to something more akin to that. And that leads to one of the other kind of probing questions, and I think we can leave it at this today, which is that we've talked about bringing residential uses into this corridors area. And so I'm curious how our calculus in terms of jobs and employment and retail services, how that might be affected by the fact that we might end up with a lot of residential uses in this area. And I'm just wondering if anybody's kind of thought through that part of this yet.
Hey, Dennis, this is Carl. Before you leave that thought, though, I think you're on track. I think the retail world, that I'm involved with every day, I see it is changing dramatically. And I think, with Alexa in my house, it's changed. So I think what sector is growing is more on the distribution logistics side versus the brick and the block of the retail stores. So keep that in mind. The other sector to think about is the office sector. Now, when you look along the corridor here, we've got a number of office parks. We've got a number of, pardon my French, big ass buildings that are not multi-tenanted friendly. And that world has changed. So as you look at the corridor, keep those two sectors in mind.
Definitely, Carl. Really good points. It's I've had friends who've been involved in retail management, and one very close friend who managed a strip shopping center, and we got into an argument one time about design requirements. And she was kind of going through this whole thing about, like, you know, regulators, you know, you're asking us too much, you're constraining us, you're telling us what we can and can't do, and my retail tenants don't want that. And I was like, hey, like, I'm looking at the centers that you manage here, and they already do that. You have like units A through K, and you can't it's not as easy to get like all of unit A, B, and just half of C. Yeah, you can do that, but the leaseor doesn't want to do that. So they're already being constrained by the finite kind of realm of the strip center and the mall. For instance, you know, the retailers don't have carte blanche when they move into a mall. They have a lot more flexibility now, maybe, than they did 70 years ago, in terms of creating a physical environment. But, you know, good Lord, you have this confined box, and you have to make your stuff fit in that box. So to some extent, you know, the commercial world already deals with this. It's just, you know, in some part it's the messenger, right? It's government saying it versus another kind of private sector collaborator. And I understand that the difference in the messenger can very often mean the difference between accepting a message and not. But I give a lot more credit to the commercial and retail sector. They're going to find a way to succeed. They're going to make it work. They're more receptive most times than I think government is, in terms of understanding what might be coming next. So I have a lot of faith that this will kind of work itself out. And I'm really happy to hear that everybody is kind of considering these things as we kind of embark on this journey over the next several months. And I'll just add, there was a wonderful comment from our Renaissance folks in terms of economic activity, and considering the existing role that this area plays in the larger kind of county economic framework. We can look, you know, maybe at establishing kind of easy to understand goals for the area. This idea of like a one-to-one replacement of, you know, either job or, you know, some unit in the tax base. I guess that would be dollars, right? Or square footage. I mean, maybe we can look at establishing goals that like everybody can understand, that are workable, that makes sense to us, and at least even if it's aspirational, maybe it's something we shoot for. Or, you know, a 2-to-1 replacement. You know, I'm not saying it has to be 1-to-1, but, you know, coming up with some way to frame it, I think, makes a lot of sense as we move forward.
I mean,
Okay.
it may be an opportunity for some kind of metric, right? That has to do with either work, you know.
Yep.
All right, good discussion, everybody. With just kind of 3 minutes left in the meeting here, I'm going to check on Eric Soder, see if he has any comment. And there is a delay, so I'm just going to give him a little bit of time. So Eric, if you want to join in, just hit *3.
So should I go grab my puppy for Eric?
In the meantime, let's talk about our puppies. So while we're waiting here, I guess we do have another meeting scheduled on the 22nd. I guess relative to the charrette, I'm not sure what the next steps will be. So let's keep that on our calendar for now. And we might end up just kind of postponing that. So Eric was hung up on, even though it still says he's connected. All right. Well, if Eric can still hear us, send us an email with your comments or give us a call. In any case, thank you all again very much. I'll be in touch about next steps, and have a great day.